9 tests failed, dropping the simulated ICU into darkness. The flaw remained hidden until a night shift technician heard a contactor close early, recognizing the missing micro delay before the screens threw an error. He logged a repair ticket and recalibrated the legacy cabinet alone. He verified the mechanical click cadence to confirm flawless power handoffs, leaving the new rig untouched. The system passed acceptance testing the next morning. Human Resources fired him before noon. "Stay here. The man they just walked out is the only one who can keep the hospitals lit." Bruce Anderson stood in the service corridor of Whitlock Energy Systems at 4:47 in the morning, checking the final air handler of his shift, with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who knew exactly what could fail. His lower back carried a dull ache. The physical cost of spending 10 hours walking polished concrete floors under harsh fluorescent light. He placed his right palm flat against the metal casing of the ventilation unit and waited. Feeling the steady vibration of the fan motor, he confirmed the mechanical integrity through touch before marking his clipboard. The loading dock was completely empty when he swiped his plastic identification badge across the security terminal. The sharp chirp echoed against the cinderblock walls, signaling his departure from the facility as he walked out into the cold morning air, pulling the collar of his gray work shirt closer to his neck. He drove his sedan through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, following the familiar route without thinking about the turns, the town remaining asleep behind closed blinds to leave the roads entirely to night shift workers making their silent commutes. The rented duplex sat near the end of a narrow street. Dropping his keys, Bruce walked straight into the kitchen, his boots making no sound on the linoleum floor as he put away the groceries. On the top shelf of the pantry, pushed far behind a row of spare light bulbs, sat a heavy gray metal lockbox with a combination dial and scratched bottom corners. Bruce did not look at the box as he stored a package of dry cereal below it, closing the pantry door with a quiet click. Eleanor Harlan emerged from the short hallway wearing a thick wool cardigan over a floral housecoat. The retired school nurse offered a brief nod, having completed her own overnight shift. Collecting her thermos from the entry table, she stepped out the front door without speaking a word, understanding the weight of the night shift. She required no explanation for the hollow look in Bruce's eyes. Bruce stood at the kitchen stove. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch as the adrenaline of the workday finally receded, leaving only the deep bone fatigue. He opened a can of condensed tomato soup, pouring the thick red liquid into a small saucepan, stirring it slowly over a low blue flame. Mabel appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her young frame entirely swallowed by oversized flannel pajamas. Carrying a small stuffed rabbit named Switch tucked under her left arm, the toy missing its left ear from an old accident in a car door, she climbed onto one of the wooden chairs, watching her father move around the small space. He placed the steaming bowl of soup directly in front of her, setting a spoon beside it. "Why are we having canned tomato soup again?" Mabel asked, looking at the red surface of the soup before looking up at his face. She did not wait for an explanation about budgets, launching into a story about a minor squabble she had witnessed on the playground at school. She described the conflict between two classmates with absolute sincerity, treating the playground drama as the central event of the week. Bruce stood at the counter with his own small bowl, absorbing her childhood concerns while resisting sleep. Listening to the cadence of her voice, he found his center in the steady rhythm of her plain existence, offering quiet, affirming responses that shielded her from the reality of his own physical depletion. An hour later, he walked her back to her room, tucking the blankets around her shoulders. He bent down to check the moon-shaped nightlight plugged into the baseboard, ensuring the small plastic bulb glowed brightly enough to push the shadows into the corners, before closing her door halfway and walking into his own bedroom, collapsing onto the mattress to sleep through the daylight hours. That evening, the cycle restarted with the sharp chirp of the badge reader at the Whitlock Energy Systems loading dock. Bruce stepped through the heavy doors, the gray facility work shirt freshly laundered but carrying the same institutional weight, and walked down the long, polished concrete service corridor with his rubber-soled boots squeaking faintly against the pristine surface. He paused outside a heavy fire-rated steel door, stopping still, The door bore stenciled yellow warnings about a restricted care testing environment, marking the boundary of the acceptance lab. Through the thick steel, he could hear the deep, constant vibration of the simulated pediatric intensive care unit load bank testing rig running its latest sequence. According to the quiet gossip among the maintenance staff, the engineering team had recorded 9 consecutive failures, with the simulated hospital floor going dark for 11 seconds during every power transfer attempt. 4 highly paid outside consultants had packed their equipment and departed without providing a solution, leaving the $84 million federal contract stalling on the verge of cancellation. Bruce closed his eyes and tipped his head slightly toward the painted cinder block wall. He waited for the specific moment in the test cycle, filtering out the ambient hum of the ventilation system and the distant whine of the servers. Then he heard it. One old relay clicked, echoing faintly through the corridor walls from a legacy cabinet housed on the floor below. The main mechanical contactor slammed shut half a beat too early, creating a heavy, violent clunk that vibrated through the floorboards. To anyone else standing in that hallway, the sound registered as standard heavy machinery noise. But to Bruce, the precise acoustic signature revealed the entire architecture of the failure. The necessary timing delay was missing from the control sequence, causing the power sources to parallel out of phase. He opened his eyes, his expression remaining blank, processing the diagnostic truth. The required timing delay was missing. Bruce walked 50 feet down the corridor to a wall-mounted maintenance terminal, logging in with his standard technician credentials to pull up the facility work order system. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, unhurried rhythm, typing out a preventative maintenance ticket for the heavy HVAC air handler mounted directly above the legacy relay cabinet on the lower level. Submitting the request took only a single keystroke, sending the digital form into the corporate queue. The screen refreshed, confirming the log ticket and returning to the blank login prompt before he turned away from the terminal, walking deliberately down the corridor toward the stairwell to begin his shift. Bruce Anderson parked his sedan in the far corner of the Whitlock Energy Systems lot just after midnight, the engine ticking as it cooled in the damp air. The heavy canvas tool bag slung over his shoulder pressed a familiar weight into his collarbone. He pulled his identification badge from his pocket and pressed it against the scanner at the loading dock entrance. The electronic chirp echoed across the empty concrete expanse, weaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. The lower-level service corridor smelled of ozone and floor wax, a space built for utility. Bruce set his bag on the polished gray floor and retrieved a heavy steel wrench. He reached up and opened the large HVAC access panel mounted above the relay cabinet, establishing the preventative maintenance cover he had logged into the system 4 hours earlier. He went to one knee before the cabinet below the air handler. He produced a smaller driver from his bag and removed the 4 screws securing the lower plate. The heavy metal cover came away to expose a thicket of wires and analog potentiometers. Reaching past the standard diagnostic interfaces, his fingers located a small, recessed port tucked deep within the casing. He had installed the backdoor connection 12 years ago, when the building's network architecture still relied on physical failsafes rather than remote authorization. Unzipping the secondary compartment of his bag, he pulled out a diagnostic laptop and a custom soldered cable with rubber coating worn smooth from years of storage. He pushed the proprietary connector into the hidden port until it seated with a solid click. He opened the laptop and waited for the screen to illuminate his hands in the dim corridor. Bruce initiated the patch code. The command prompt filled with cascading lines of text, executing the instructions to reintroduce the delay sequence into the solid-state controller. The progress bar moved across the bottom of the screen, a slow crawl of white blocks against black. 5 floors above, the modern network security systems registered the anomaly. The automated defense protocols flagged an undocumented data exchange originating from a hardware node on the ground floor. An internal alarm triggered within the cybersecurity mainframe and initiated a trace sequence to identify the physical location of the intrusion. The timing window narrowed on Bruce's screen. The modern architecture operated with a speed the original systems had never possessed. He typed the masking sequence to cloak the laptop's media access control address. He moved with a fast precision that left no room for thought. The progress bar reached the final sector just as the security trace hit the subnet. Bruce struck the enter key. The screen flashed a confirmation message. The network registered the data insertion as a routine load balance flutter and dropped the trace. Bruce pulled the custom cable from the hidden port. He closed the laptop and put the equipment back into his bag. He replaced the lower plate on the cabinet, driving the 4 screws home with exact turns of his wrist. Standing up, he secured the HVAC access panel above, leaving the corridor looking exactly as it had 10 minutes earlier. He hoisted the tool bag onto his shoulder and walked back toward the loading dock, his stride steady on the concrete. Sitting in the driver's seat of his sedan in the dark parking lot, Bruce left the engine off. The cold night air seeped through the glass. He opened his cellular phone, the pale screen providing the only light in the vehicle. The email he had drafted to Martin Voss, the local attorney who handled Laurel's estate, contained the copied whistleblower logs with the transfer timing data and the evidence of the bypassed safety protocols. He pressed send. The phone searched for a secure connection with the external mail server. A loading icon spun in a continuous circle on the screen. The network connection stalled, trapped in a dead zone caused by the heavy structural shielding of the Whitlock facility. The message remained hanging in the outbox, undelivered. Bruce closed the phone, placed it in his pocket, and started the engine. He pulled out of the lot carrying the knowledge that his only insurance policy had not cleared the building. That morning, the fluorescent lights of the acceptance lab illuminated a room crowded with engineers standing in rigid posture. Alden Price stood near the primary console with his arms crossed over his chest. The team initiated the 58th test sequence of the simulated pediatric intensive care unit load bank. When the primary grid power dropped, the transfer sequence engaged. The telemetry graph remained stable. The system transferred the power load, achieving a clean average of exactly 2.4 seconds. The simulated hospital floor never lost power. The tension in the room broke into a murmur of low voices. Alden stepped closer to the screen, verifying the data readouts twice. He did not understand how the system had corrected itself, but the numbers on the display were solid. The federal contract was secure. Alden picked up the desk telephone and dialed Graham Sutter's office. He delivered the report of the successful test, his voice carrying the tone of a man who had survived a disaster he could not explain. Graham Sutter sat at his pristine desk in his quiet office overlooking the engineering floor. The surface of his desk was bare, save for a single silver laptop and a multi-line telephone. He listened to Alden's report without interrupting, acknowledging the success with a measured response. He placed the receiver back in its cradle. Graham did not smile. He pulled his laptop closer and opened the deep security logs from the overnight shift. He cross-referenced the silent network anomaly from the lower level with the physical access records of the building. His eyes scanned the time-stamped entries moving down the columns of data. The network anomaly highlighted in red, aligned with a single badge swipe at the loading dock. Graham sat in the quiet of his office. The name Bruce Anderson sat next to the corresponding time window. Graham did not reach for the phone. He left his hand flat on the desk, staring coldly at the timestamp. Graham Sutter remained seated at his desk, identifying the exact timestamp of the network anomaly on his silver laptop before cross-referencing it with a single badge swipe at the loading dock. The glow of the screen illuminated his face as he watched the digital footprint resolve into a single, irrefutable name. He did not pull the internal security alarm. He pulled the outbound server logs instead, locating an encrypted email packet trapped in the internal network queue that was directed toward a local attorney named Martin Voss. Graham saw the legal vulnerability with the clarity of a man who spent his life measuring institutional exposure. Firing a technician who had just reported a federal safety violation would expose Whitlock Energy Systems to catastrophic liability and dissolve the $84 million contract in a storm of federal audits. He executed a series of administrative commands, cleanly bypassing standard authorization protocols. The keystrokes were deliberate and unhurried. He terminated the outbound email node, revoked Bruce Anderson's physical badge access, and deleted the queued message before it ever crossed the firewall, leaving no trace on the external servers. Retrieving the printed security logs, Graham smoothed the heavy paper and walked to Marin Whitlock's office. Marin sat behind her expansive desk, reading a summary report of the morning's successful acceptance test. The room smelled faintly of ozone from the HVAC vents and expensive leather. Graham placed the log before her, carrying the posture of a man managing a routine procedural violation rather than a crisis. He explained the situation in measured institutional terms, framing the unauthorized connection to the legacy port as a malicious cyber-sabotage attempt against the pediatric intensive care unit load bank. He did not raise his voice. He let the severity of the words carry their own weight. Marin did not know Bruce Anderson. She had never seen his name beyond a standard payroll summary, but she knew the federal contract required absolute security. She asked 2 clarifying questions about their legal exposure. Then she accepted Graham's containment argument regarding a termination for cause to isolate the threat. She signed the termination order in 12 minutes, believing she was preserving the company her father built. Bruce Anderson walked across the engineering floor when his 2-way radio instructed him to report to Conference Room B. He stopped for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening around his clipboard until the plastic cracked under the pressure. The sound was small, lost in the ambient hum of the facility, but it registered the exact weight of what was coming. He opened the heavy wooden door and found a cold, brightly lit space designed for institutional executions. Graham Sutter sat at the long table. Marin Whitlock stood near the window, watching the parking lot below with the distant posture of someone who preferred not to look closely at the machinery of consequence. Graham did not ask him to sit. He informed Bruce in a voice devoid of heat that his employment was terminated for attempting to implant malicious code into a restricted critical care testing environment. Graham slid a densely typed document across the polished table. It outlined a $10 million corporate countersuit and a criminal referral for industrial sabotage if Bruce ever discussed the network event with anyone outside the room. The paper rested there, crisp and final. Bruce did not reach for it. He absorbed the threat. His posture didn't change, and his eyes never left Graham's face. He looked at the printed words, recognizing the ruthless architecture of a trap designed to bury the truth alongside his livelihood. "Do you want the hospitals to stay lit, or the file to look clean?" Bruce asked, his voice calm and measured. Graham refused to engage with the technical reality. He tapped the document with one manicured finger while maintaining his strict legal framing. "The concern here is the integrity of the testing environment, not your intentions," Graham said. Bruce dismissed the man and looked at Marin Whitlock. He studied her for a long moment, seeing a chief executive officer who did not possess the truth of her own building. The silence held between them, stretched tight by the things left unsaid. "Read your father's first microgrid drawings," Bruce said. He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the room to fall into step between the 2 security guards waiting in the hallway, his posture unbroken. Marin remained standing by the window as the heavy door clicked shut. The silence in the room changed as Graham gathered his folders and offered a brief reassurance before leaving her alone. She walked out into the engineering floor hallway. The rhythm of the morning shift moved around her, but Bruce's parting words occupied her thoughts. She approached Orson Bell near a diagnostic station and asked a single, carefully worded question about whether her father's first microgrid drawings still existed in the archive. Orson looked at her. His posture deferred to her title, but his expression carried a weight she could not measure. He acknowledged that the drawings existed and walked away down the bright hallway. Bruce walked out through the loading dock doors with a cardboard box containing his jacket and his coffee mug pressed against his chest. He stood in the center of the asphalt parking lot alone. He pulled his cellular phone from his pocket. A red notification confirmed his message to Martin Voss had failed to send. He remained in the quiet air, the truth locked inside the building behind him, and his only insurance policy dead in the queue. The morning shift was fully underway, the distant hum of the facility's massive generators vibrating through the pavement beneath his work boots. He looked at the heavy steel doors of the loading dock one last time, measuring the distance between the life he had built and the sudden silence of unemployment. He placed the cellular phone back into his pocket with deliberate care, adjusted his grip on the cardboard box, and took the long walk across the lot toward his car, stepping into the uncertain space of the day ahead. Bruce Anderson sat in the driver's seat of his sedan outside the brick facade of the Cedar Falls Elementary School, the engine running just enough to keep the heater circulating warm air through the cabin. The midday sun threw hard, unforgiving angles across the asphalt parking lot, casting shadows that felt too sharp for an afternoon that was supposed to be spent in the muted fluorescent light of a facility's service corridor. In the trunk of the vehicle, resting against the spare tire well, a single cardboard box held a heavy winter jacket, a ceramic coffee mug, and a handful of basic hand tools. He watched the heavy metal double doors of the school entrance, counting the minutes before the final bell. The heavy doors pushed open, releasing a sudden wave of small bodies into the bright air. Mabel emerged near the edge of the crowd, wearing her green winter coat and clutching Switch under her left arm by his one remaining ear. She took the descending concrete steps with the deliberate caution of a child who had learned to watch her footing. Moving toward the usual pickup zone, she scanned the line of idling minivans, stopping her progression entirely when she saw his sedan parked in the visitor space in the middle of the afternoon. Mabel did not run to the vehicle. Standing on the sidewalk, she processed the visual anomaly of her father existing in the daylight hours before walking slowly toward the passenger door and pulling the handle. Climbing into the passenger seat, she pulled the belt across her chest until the metal tongue clicked into the receptacle. She studied him, her eyes bright with sudden calculation. "You are here before the sun goes down," she said, stating the fact plainly. "Can we go get the fried chicken in the paper bucket tonight?" Bruce placed his hands on the steering wheel, gripping the worn leather at the 10 and 2 positions until his knuckles lost their color and turned a stark, bloodless white against the dark material. A deep cold expanded inside his chest, freezing the air in his lungs. His checking account held enough for the next rent payment, and exactly 1 month of groceries if they eliminated all fresh produce. The cost of maintaining independent health insurance without a corporate subsidy exceeded that remainder by $400. The legal retainer required to fight a federal sabotage accusation filed by a billion-dollar corporation was a number that did not exist in his world. The sharp physical ache of a man standing at the absolute edge of a sheer drop radiated through his ribs. He released his grip on the wheel very slowly, returning the blood to his fingers. "We need to eat the soup in the cabinet tonight," Bruce said, his voice dropping into a soft, steady register that betrayed nothing of the tension vibrating in his bones. "I need to look at some things at the house." Mabel accepted the answer, the way she accepted the sudden darkness in a hallway. She nodded once, a small, concise motion, and pulled Switch tighter against her chest, wrapping both of her small arms around the worn fabric. She asked no further questions as Bruce shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from the curb. The interior of the duplex was silent when they arrived, carrying the distinct, heavy stillness of a house that was accustomed to being empty during the daylight hours. Bruce walked into the kitchen and stood before the narrow pantry, the air smelling faintly of old wood and dried pasta. Reaching past the spare light bulbs and the emergency flashlight on the top shelf, his fingers closed around the cold, scratched metal of the heavy lockbox. He pulled the container down, setting it onto the scarred surface of the kitchen table with a solid thud that seemed too loud for the small room. Turning the small combination dial, he listened to the precise mechanical clicks of the tumblers aligning into place. The latch released. He lifted the heavy metal lid. Inside the box, resting on top of a sealed paper envelope addressed in his own handwriting, lay a faded photograph of Laurel standing beside the first assembled load bank prototype 12 years ago. The specific gravity of that grief would compromise the work he had to accomplish, so he kept his gaze averted. Moving his hand past the photograph, past the printed email from Calvin Whitlock praising his initial load-balancing architecture, he closed his fingers around a small, heavy object wrapped in dark, anti-static plastic. The item was an ironclad, heavily encrypted, solid-state digital storage drive. Bruce carried it into the living room, sitting down at the small wooden desk tucked into the corner near the window. He plugged the metal drive into the side port of his home computer, waiting for the verification prompt to appear on the screen. Typing a 32-character cryptographic key, he unlocked the partition. The screen populated with the raw, unmodified source code and the complete version control commit history from 12 years prior. The files contained the exact foundational architecture of the timing sequence he had restored the previous night, bearing his digital signature on every critical line. He prepared the documents, methodically organizing the technical proof. The engineering executive suite at Whitlock Energy Systems maintained a steady climate-controlled temperature of exactly 68 degrees. The air filtered and entirely odorless. Graham Sutter sat behind his expansive, clear glass desk, his posture relaxed and perfectly aligned with the high back of his leather chair. Alden Price stood in the center of the office, holding a thick stack of printed compliance reports in both hands, his knuckles tense. Marin Whitlock stood near the heavy wooden door, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. "The physical patch works," Alden said, placing the heavy stack of documents onto the glass surface of Graham's desk. The binder landed with a dull slap. Transfer times held cleanly at 2.4 seconds on the first cycle, but the documentation attached to the certification file is entirely fraudulent. The manual outlines a mechanical switching procedure that does not exist in the active hardware. Graham did not reach for the papers. He looked at the printed stack, acknowledging its presence without accepting responsibility for the mess. "The system functions," Graham said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of urgency. "Our client requires functional reliability, which we have now secured. Any internal documentation mapping is an administrative cleanup task for the next quarter. Close the active file, Alden. The compliance gap is an internal matter." Alden pressed his hands flat against the glass desk, leaning forward. "It is a federal safety compliance violation," he said. "If the audit team runs the manual against the physical board, they will see the discrepancy in 10 minutes. They will see a working microgrid," Graham corrected, shifting his gaze to Marin. He delivered his containment argument with the smooth, frictionless ease of a man who had survived a dozen corporate panics. "Marin, if we open a formal investigation into the documentation history today, we legally mandate a suspension of the acceptance process. The hospitals remain vulnerable. The $84 million contract dissolves, and the board will demand immediate leadership changes for failing to secure the deployment. We fix the software quietly, and we move forward." Marin stood by the door, the heavy brass handle resting near her hip. The quiet question she had asked Orson Bell in the hallway the previous afternoon remained unresolved, pointing toward a fundamental discrepancy in the architecture of the system she owned. She looked at Graham, seeing a man who possessed 14 years of unblemished operational success, a man who had protected her father's company through every regulatory hurdle. The pressure of the federal contract was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She took a slow breath, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second, and let the discrepancy bury itself under the necessity of keeping the hospital contract intact. "Defer to Graham's timeline on the administrative cleanup," Marin said, her voice tight and formal. "Secure the acceptance file." Night covered the duplex, stripping the last remaining warmth from the living room. Bruce Anderson sat perfectly still at the small wooden desk, the house silent except for the low, rhythmic hum of the kitchen refrigerator cycling through its cooling phase. The monitor of his home computer had gone dark, entering its sleep sequence. On the edge of the desk, plugged into the side port of the machine, the encrypted storage drive pulsed with a steady, rhythmic blue light. The small LED indicator flashed every 2 seconds, a relentless digital heartbeat in the dark room. Bruce watched the illumination blink against the grain of the cheap wood, calculating the exact cost of what he was about to do. Alden Price stood in the center of the executive office, his hands pressed flat against Marin Whitlock's expansive glass desk as morning sunlight cast a stark reflection across the surface. He looked directly at her, his posture carrying the inflexible rigidity of a man who had reached his professional limit. Wearing a standard blue work shirt that smelled faintly of copper wire. Leaning closer, his voice dropped low, vibrating with a tension that had built since the microgrid's acceptance test. The documentation gap, he stated, was not an administrative error that could be corrected next quarter, but a structural omission that would trigger a federal fraud investigation the moment auditors matched the paperwork against the active hardware. The timing sequence operating the relays was absent from the certified manuals, a reality he described using precise technical terms. Marin stood by the window, watching the traffic below while absorbing the scale of the federal liability, the numbers proving that Graham Sutter's containment strategy had collapsed. The reality of the missing documentation would dismantle the massive hospital contract and drag the entire company into criminal prosecution. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of decades of corporate assumption breaking apart. She offered no defensive argument, nor did she raise her voice, but instead walked past him out of the office. She descended the staircase to the engineering floor, her heels striking the concrete in a sharp, deliberate rhythm. The temperature on the lower level was kept a precise 4 degrees cooler than the executive suites. Walking past the rows of diagnostic stations, she ignored the hum of the machinery, moving with a directness that caused several junior technicians to step back as she headed toward the far corner of the room. Orson Bell sat reviewing a printed schematic with the methodical focus of a man who had spent 40 years reading circuits. Marin stood beside his scarred workstation, waiting until he set his pen down before asking him for the absolute truth regarding the transfer sequence architecture. Her voice lacked its usual corporate authority, reduced instead to the cadence of a person asking to be unburdened of a lie. Orson offered no reaction, nor did he ask her to clarify the sudden request. He reached down to the bottom drawer of his desk, pulling the heavy metal handle to withdraw a clear plastic protective sleeve, sliding it across the surface until it rested in front of her. Inside the plastic lay a faded diner receipt, yellowed with age, bearing a faint blue pencil sketch of a load-balancing logic sequence. The initials BA were printed in the bottom right corner, a ghost in a machine that had run their flagship product for years. Marin stared at the paper, realizing she had been walking in the wrong direction for her entire life. Reaching into his pocket, Orson produced a heavy metal key, setting it down next to the receipt with a solid clink. This object, he told her in a voice roughened by years of inhaled flux, was the master decryption key to a legacy server partition that Calvin Whitlock had isolated before his death. Her father had trusted him to keep it safe until someone finally asked the right question. A day he had waited 12 years to see arrive. Marin took the key, the cold metal pressing into her palm, and walked toward the restricted server room where the heavy steel door required her executive badge. The panel chimed once before the locking mechanism disengaged with an echoing thud, granting her access to the archive. The interior was loud with the roar of cooling fans, the air rushing past in a freezing current. Racks of modern servers stood in identical rows, their panels flashing with rapid lights in chaotic bursts. But she moved past the active hardware until she reached the very back corner. Bolted to a reinforced steel table stood a single gray terminal, entirely separate from the active network. She inserted the key into the port on the side of the casing, turning the metal until it clicked, before typing her administrative credentials into the mechanical keyboard. The keys offered heavy resistance, demanding deliberate force for every letter she struck as she bypassed 12 years of security. The monitor flared to life, casting a pale reflection against her dark eyes as digital logs populated the screen in cascading lines of green text. The record was preserved in a read-only archive that no subsequent update could overwrite, a digital vault that held the foundation of the company's success. She read through Bruce Anderson's original commit histories, tracing the exact blueprints of the timing delay that currently operated the microgrid with perfect reliability. Beside them, verified with a cryptographic signature, were Graham Sutter's footprints altering the Whitlock standard transfer sequence documentation. The logs showed Graham systematically removing Bruce's name from every technical file, replacing the elegant safety logic with generic mechanical descriptions that satisfied the regulators while hiding the truth. She gripped the edge of the metal table until the knuckles lost all color, anchoring herself against the sudden, absolute shift in her understanding of her own company. For 12 years, she had allowed Whitlock Energy to become an institution that rewarded executives for generating flawless compliance reports while rendering the frontline architects of their safety completely invisible. Graham had not broken the microgrid. He had simply operated under the toxic corporate assumption that a signed legal document held more authority than the laws of physics. It was a machine designed to protect the men who managed the files, while ruthlessly discarding the men who kept the hospitals lit. Initiating the print command, she listened to the laser printer grind as it produced the pages, the mechanical noise echoing in the small space. She gathered the warm paper, placed it into a manila folder, and carried the undeniable truth back up the stairs to her office. Sitting behind her glass desk, she picked up her multi-line phone and dialed the direct numbers for the directors. calling an emergency session for 2 o'clock that afternoon with a tone that accepted no scheduling conflicts. The corporate boardroom was a vast space designed to intimidate, featuring a long, polished oak table surrounded by heavy leather chairs. Marin stood at the head of the table, her posture straight, a single manila folder resting on the wood in front of her. Graham Sutter sat near the center of the room, his suit perfectly pressed, a silver pen resting parallel to his legal pad as he projected his usual calm, reasonable authority. He looked at Marin, carrying a patient certainty that whatever she presented could be easily managed. Opening the folder, she distributed the printed server logs to the 12 men and women seated around the table before initiating the projector to cast the digital footprints onto the large screen. Pointing directly to the timestamps and the access credentials, she let the green text glow against the white wall, the stark numbers refusing to bend to corporate interpretation. She detailed exactly how Graham had exposed Whitlock Energy to federal criminal prosecution for safety fraud, explaining the mechanical reality of the missing documentation. She outlined how the falsified reports for the massive hospital contract constituted a deliberate deception of regulatory agencies, speaking in long, measured sentences that refused to let the heavy silence break her rhythm as she presented the facts with the unyielding momentum of a falling stone. Graham shifted in his chair, adopting the tone of a man explaining a complicated necessity to people who lacked the technical background to understand the industry. The alterations, he argued with a smooth cadence, were standard administrative streamlining, a necessary adjustment to secure the commercial viability of the product in a competitive market. His hands betrayed him, the fingers curling tightly against the leather armrests, the knuckles turning white under the strain of maintaining his frictionless exterior. The directors looked from the projected logs on the wall to the printed pages in their hands, the reality of the federal liability settling over the room with crushing weight. This evidence was absolute, a mathematical certainty that left no room for containment strategies, public relations spins, or internal cleanup operations. The senior member, a man with 30 years of corporate litigation experience, placed his hands flat on the table and called for a formal vote that required no debate. The vote was unanimous. The group terminated Graham Sutter for cause, immediately severing his financial stake and revoking his access to the building and all networks. Graham stood up from his chair, the polished exterior he had maintained for a decade dissolving in 20 minutes, leaving a man stripped of the institution that had defined his existence. Without speaking, he picked up his silver pen, slid it into his inside jacket pocket, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors without looking back. Marin remained at the head of the table until the room emptied and the heavy wooden doors clicked shut. She closed the cardboard cover over the printed pages, stepping out into a corridor where the air felt abruptly thin and cold. Instead of returning to her office to acknowledge the victory, she reached into her pocket, withdrew her phone, and dialed the number for Dana Whitcomb's law office in Des Moines. Bruce Anderson sat across the long, polished oak table from Marin Whitlock, his posture carrying the quiet stillness of a man who had already calculated the weight of the room. The conference room at Dana Whitcomb's law office in Des Moines was a windowless box on the 14th floor, containing only a water pitcher, a speakerphone, and 3 stacks of paper. Dana Whitcomb, a 46-year-old attorney, distributed the final settlement documents, the heavy stock sliding across the polished oak with the dry sound of a transaction closing. The agreement regarding the timeline discrepancy sat directly beside the retroactive licensing payout for the Anderson transfer logic. Marin Whitlock sat opposite him, staring down at the signature line. She offered no apology. The first page listed his reinstatement as principal grid architect, effective immediately, while the second outlined the retroactive payout for the logic controllers. Bruce picked up a black pen from the center tray. He read the clauses line by line, uncapped the pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the third page, closing the binder and pushing it back across the table without looking at Marin's face. 3 days later, Bruce walked through the front entrance of Whitlock Energy Systems. He clipped a new badge to the breast pocket of his work shirt, the plastic reading Principal Grid Architect. When he stepped onto the main engineering floor, the conversations around the fabrication presses stopped. The machinery ran on, the low industrial hum filling the sudden quiet of the staff. He walked down the center aisle, steady and unbothered by the sudden attention. Some of the older technicians stopped their work and gave slow, slight nods, while the newer hires stood in tight clusters near the tool cages watching him pass. Bruce did not stop at the management offices on the second floor. Marin stepped out of the executive stairwell and stopped at the railing overlooking the floor. She carried no notes and had allowed no press into the building. She waited until the last of the voices from the tool cages faded, looking out over the 300 engineers and technicians. Then she read a single sentence from the corporate mandate. Whitlock Energy acknowledges Bruce Anderson as the sole architect of the transfer logic currently operating in its critical care microgrid systems. Bruce did not stop his walk down the aisle. He offered no speech, turning instead to the nearest diagnostic station, pulling a maintenance manual from the rack and opening it to the first page. 3 months later, the first ice storm of the winter encased the region in a frozen shell. Inside the duplex on Tillman Road, the ambient temperature held steady at 68 degrees. Bruce stood in the hallway listening to the wind hit the single-pane windows, waiting. Mabel stood near her bedroom door, clutching her stuffed rabbit Switch against her chest by its remaining ear. She rubbed her eyes, looking past the steady yellow glow of the hallway nightlight toward the living room window, where the streetlights were completely dead. "The wind is loud," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Bruce looked down at the soft yellow light reflecting on the floorboards and then at his daughter. "It's just a storm," Bruce said, his voice keeping its low, steady rhythm. "The battery for your light will last all night. Go back to bed." Mabel nodded slowly, turned around, and padded back into her room. At 2 a.m, the Whitlock control room was empty except for the overnight operator and Bruce. The space was illuminated by the green glow of the telemetry grid monitors mapping the 32 rural hospitals across the state. A text message appeared on the central console display, routed from the facility director at the Decorah Hospital. It contained 4 words. The lights held steady. Bruce looked up at the main displays, watching the stable transfer logs refresh in unbroken green columns. He rested his hands flat on the edge of the console, feeling the faint, steady vibration of the servers running 1 floor below. There were no press releases here, and no executives to claim the victory. There was only the quiet hum of the machinery, and a man ensuring the grid held its ground against the dark, the continuous lines of power for another minute, pulled his hands back, and went back to work.